and go.
All right, so what we want to talk about tonight is I had a bunch of suggestions, and there were a bunch that were about like Reconstruction and like civil rights stuff, and I kind of had wanted to talk about the Civil War for a while, so I figured rather than kind of go through the rigmarole of picking a topic.
Hi, sorry, technical errors.
Did it work? Did it work? Did it work?
I mean, people are saying that it's not working, so let's see if it's working now. That was an on me one. Sorry.
Is it working? Can people hear me now? Can you hear me now? Lag? Can you hear me now? Oh my God. We're good.
Gotta wait and maybe recap what we're talking about.
Right. So we're gonna start talking about the events that lead up to the Civil War, and then the Civil War itself, and then the period afterwards, the Reconstruction period, and then that sort of leads into a discussion of like civil rights and stuff. So we'll talk about that as well, because I think it's like a big topic. I know a lot about that. There's a lot of weird things you can say about that. So we've kind of figured we would do that. Right, and like I said, we had some good topics. Somebody asked about Stalingrad. That's a really good one. Someone asked about Spanish-American War. It's another really good one. At some point, somebody asked about British Prime Minister sex scandals, which is there's only a limited number of those because it's Britain and they're all very repressed over there. But we can talk about Gladstone and his prostitutes, and we can talk about well, I mean, the monarchy's got a better set of sex scandals. So. Yeah, is it?
Yes, we are good. So let's talk about the info.
Is it? I mean, is it working?
Okay,
Yeah, people are saying.
I forgot to add my camera to the feed, and your audio is tied to my camera, and your camera is my audio.
I don't understand. Okay, who's there? Give me some names.
Oh, we got Chris, we got Ashley, we got PC, we got Heather, we got Karen, we got Cindy, we got Chris, we got Teresa.
Very nice. That's awesome. Thanks, everybody.
I mean, probably more people that have not commented that they could hear you or could not hear you.
Okay. So, so the first thing is, when did the Civil War start? And I mean, like, really, why? And you could really go way back. I mean, you could go way, way back. But I feel like the 1850s is a pretty reasonable time to wind the clock back without this having to be a lecture about all of 19th century American history before the Civil War. So, basically, to put it bluntly, you had a controversy over slavery that had been kind of at a low level for the entirety of American history, really. And it never quite really went away in the political sphere. And then what happened is it became kind of unavoidable by the 1850s. So we went to war with Mexico in the 1840s. We annexed a whole bunch of territory from Mexico in the 1840s, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. And that kind of completely brought the slavery controversy back, because now you had all this huge amount of territory, and the inevitable question was like, are these new territories going to be slave states or free states? The Missouri Compromise from the 1820s had argued that you just draw a line across the middle of the country and everything above the line is free and everything below is slave. So people proposed extending that line, and that would have been okay. But on the other hand, what happened is you get this crazy situation in California, right? So California is a Bear Flag Republic. There had been a small Anglo settlement in California in the war, and the crazy, weird adventurer kind of guy, John C. Fremont, who was the kind of the sort of founding father of California in a way, was married to Jessie Benton, who is the daughter of Senator Thomas Hart Benton from Missouri. He's one of the leading senators of the pre-Civil War era. And so Fremont was this kind of really well-known guy who has got this great publicity and has written books and stuff. And Fremont had helped to start the Bear Flag Republics, California, right? And when California came into the Union, they demanded to be given sort of the same consideration that Texas had, which is they wanted to come in as a single state that was not going to be split up or anything. And when Southerners had proposed splitting Texas up, like a Christmas ham, you could just carve off a chunk of Texas every time you needed a new Southern state. And there's like 8 or 10 senators that are Southerners from Texas that you could have. The Texans rather reacted with, outrage. It's like, this is the sacred Texas, with Alamo and, Battle of San Jacinto, and you can't be carving up Texas, right? And never mind that barely anybody lived west of the 100th meridian or in what is today like the Oklahoma territory that was connected to Texas. They were like, this is our sacred, Jim Bowie and then Travis and everybody died for this stuff, right? So California sort of had the same idea, right? And the good news is no one really cared about California. I mean, it was like, it's 2 people live there. It's like 1,000,000 miles away. It's across the Great American Desert. Like, no one's going there. And then, of course, in 1848, you get the sort of the world-changing discovery. There was a Swiss guy who had fled his loveless marriage because he's married his wife and he totally hated her. She was stupid or whatever. So he goes to the East Coast and it doesn't work out. So he ends up in California, of all god awful places, and he's running a mill. And they're digging. They got a bunch of Mormon immigrants that are out there, and they came out west when they figured the Mormons would eventually catch up with them, and they would make money in the meantime. And when the Mormons showed up, they'd take the money and help set up the Mormon, Zion Kingdom or whatever. And these dudes, they had it. By the way, the whole thing started because they had this lady they hired as a cook, and she was a real shitty cook. And he's just sneezing. And so she was apparently like, she was a shitty cook, but like all shitty cooks, she was convinced that she was a super awesome cook. And she was all like, I make these great meals. And everybody's like, it's baked shoe leather. Like, shut the fuck up. But apparently what the Mormons did is they rolled up to this guy's name is Sutter. And they said, Sutter, like, okay, this lady can't cook. She can't boil water. We're not doing this. We want meals at like a regular time and we want to have good food. So they wanted the right to build themselves a dormitory. And in the result of this, the plans for the mill kind of changed and whatever. And to make a long story short, they discovered, among all things, they discovered gold in the creek under Sutter's mill, the creek that they were using to power the water-powered sawmill and chop down all the trees and cut them was full of gold. And so they go to local army guys. And it's like a colonel and a captain or somebody. And the captain is a guy named William Tecumseh Sherman. He's from Ohio. He's got a brother named John. And Sherman they bring this nugget of gold to Sherman. And they're like, we want to register a land claim. And Sherman is like, look, buddy, this is like American territory. It's owned by the government. We just kicked the Mexicans out. It's like, like 6 months ago or whatever. And he's like, you're probably fine. Just build a fence or some shit. And then, like whatever. And of course they're like, we kind of really need it to be like more for real. And Sherman's like, what the fuck, you find gold? And they're like, and so they pull this gold nugget out, and Sherman apparently tests it. He bites it and it dents because you can bite pure gold. They hit it with some it's like some ammonium or something, and it makes it tarnish really well. And they beat it with a hammer and flatten it out until it's really, really thin. And so Sherman is like, yeah, for this fucking gold. And it's like the nugget's like this big, so it's like $10,000 worth of gold. And so all of a sudden, this news gets out. It actually hits South America first because the ships come around. There's no Panama Canal or anything, so they go down and they go to Peru and Chile, and in like Valparaiso and all that stuff, you get what the fuck is it? It's there's a watch charger. And you get people.
Where did you know you get it?
Because it's freaking me out on the floor.
Do you think it is a tiny, tiny white snake?
Yeah, it's a white snake. And so, having said that, next it'll be playing Foreigner and Poison. And so I've got a Poison album upstairs. Just gives Poison to stuff. We get high later. Listen to some Poison to be great. And so, what happens is when the news hits Drinks. When the news hits the East Coast, you get a huge wave of immigrants going for California. And it made sense because if you can cross the Rockies and the Sierra Madre Mountains and stuff, California's got a way better climate than the rest of the Central American plains. And you can settle there. So just thousands and thousands of people go. So all of a sudden, in early 1850, you have this pressure cooker of issues that have reached this kind of boiling point. And the central issue is, what are we going to do about fucking California? Right? The Californians want to come in. They want to come in as a free state. And like a lot of states, it's not so much that they hate slavery. It's that a lot of people worry about African-American workers coming in and undercutting the white laborers. Right? It's not so much that Californians are up in a tizzy about the immorality of slavery. It's that they worry that if black people come in, they would be willing to do the same jobs white people would be for. I mean, no, like.
If they're enslaved, they're forced to.
No. They're talking about free black laborers coming in, and they would undercut white laborers, right? Whether or not that would actually happen, that was the work. That's why a lot of states, even in the North, had very restrictive laws regulating black labor, because white workers were afraid that if you brought in black labor, they would be so desperate for jobs that they would be willing to work the same jobs that white people would work, but for like half the cost. And so Illinois is a free state, but it has this complicated law about free black labor for like 40 years into the 1850s or something, right? And so that was a big thing in the Midwest. And so California comes in or wants to come in as a free state. So it goes to Washington, right? There's a paralysis in Washington what to do. So President Zachary Taylor is old rough and ready, they call him. He was the general who attacked Mexico in 1848, went down all the way to Mexico City, right? And he had no political ideology. He thought he could be president. So he ran and he won, and he didn't have a fucking clue. Right? It's like it's Robert Redford in that movie, The Candidate, where he becomes president and he's like, "What do I do now?" Right? And so, yeah, it's Robert Redford. Yeah, it's like 70s, like mid 70s. And so he's before he became director of Shield, and they shot him or something. I don't know. And so what happened then is you get this crisis where Zachary Taylor doesn't have a freaking clue, right? And he doesn't. He sort of is like, I'm just the president. I don't know. So and then in the middle of it, in 1850, in the summer, he goes out and gives a big speech, eats a bowl of cherries and cream, and he goes back to the White House, and he's really hot, and he suffers an attack of acute gastroenteritis, and he dies. He dies, yeah. And there's a whole theory that he was poisoned by Southerners, that he whacked him. And his grandson lived until the 1960s, that is to the 1960, and he actually asked the U.S. government to exhume Zachary Taylor and give him an autopsy, and they did, and they found out that he had not been poisoned. Right, the arsenic levels were consistent with consuming cherries, not with like massive doses of arsenic poison, which is wild. Also, I think Benjamin Harrison is the other U.S. president from the 19th century who had a grandson that lived until like the 1970s or something like that. What is? Robert Redford was not Nick Fury. David Hasselhoff, David's Hasselfrau, Zardu Hasselfrau was Nick Fury. And Robert Redford was the Shield director dude in the Winter Soldier. Yeah, I don't know what he's talking about. What does Francis Drake know about Marvel movies? And so, anyway, so what happens is he goes to Congress, right? They kick this to Congress, and there's a bunch of issues that are kind of like percolating around this. And Henry Clay, Kentucky Whig, the great compromiser, Clay tries to solve this problem, and he fails. He fails. He creates a bill called the Omnibus Bill, and an omnibus today is like a thing that kind of collects everything or like solves everything. Like if you have a series of books and you put them in an omnibus, it's all in the same cover, right, in the same physical book. And so he puts together a bill they call the Omnibus Bill, which collects a solution to all these problems. And the reason they call it that is that back in the day, omnibus was a word for a horse-drawn carriage that was public transportation. It was like a horse-drawn wagon that you could pay to sit in the back of, and it would do like laps around the city. And the joke about the Omnibus Bill was it had so much crap in it, it was a seat for everybody. There was a seat for everybody. This bullshit. And of course, the thing that Henry Clay failed to understand is that if you put something for everybody in a bill, there's also something for everybody to vote against. And if people have compromise on the mind, they'll focus on the thing they like and be like, I'll vote for that. But of course, 1850, everybody has, not that on the mind, and they think instead, I'm not going to vote for this one thing. I'm going to vote against the things I hate. So the omnibus bill dies like a raise for school teachers. It just blows up. And Clay gives like 70 speeches for it, and it fails. And the last one in his last speech in the Senate, they bring in John C. Calhoun. He was in a hotel and he was sick, and he wrote a speech where he was like, "I hate Clay and everything he stands for, and blah blah blah, Northerners and blah blah, slavery's great, and I'm a horrible racist and whatever." And they bring him in. They take the door of the hotel he's in off the hinges, and they put him on the door and wrap him in a blanket and physically carry him into the Senate room. And he can't read the speech. And I want to say it was like James Henry Hammond, his protege, who gave the speech in the Senate. It was like, Calhoun got the floor and then Hammond read the speech. By the way, if you're following at home, Hammond is the South Carolina senator who had a plantation it was up away from Charleston on this Georgia-South Carolina border. He got it because he married his wife and she had a lot of money and he bought it with her money. But on the plantation, he bought a slave, had sex with her, had a kid, and about 15 years later had sex with the kid. Which is a for real story that for real happened, I swear to God, and it was the worst. And by the way, South Carolina senators are like not super great.
Sorry, I have to stare in my face before.
That's a for real story. It's a for real story. I have books about that. Not in a weird way. And so, oh God, I mean, how hard is it to figure out? It's like just you don't need a diagram, do you? And so so anyway, Calhoun dies afterwards, and so does Clay. Clay's got tuberculosis. He goes to Martha's Vineyard, and there's a picture of him I show people, and he looks like Skeletor. I mean, he looks like, but not in like a cool way, like in a guy that's like a skull, like he's gonna die. And for some reason, I'm assured by my dad is a physician that he's got these eyes that pop. They're like sparkly, and that's apparently like you're gonna die from tuberculosis. Your eyes get sparkly. And it's like that's a death. That's like a death sign. And it was like something to do with blood chemistry. I don't know, something, oxygen in the blood or something. So anyway, what happens? You get Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas comes along, and Stephen Douglas, who is a little giant, a former lawyer and judge from Illinois, had puts together a bill. And what Stephen Douglas does is a smart thing. He does what Clay did in 1820. He takes each individual problem and he solves it in the most popular way possible, puts together enough votes to pass it, passes it, and then uses that momentum to solve the next one and the next one and the next one. And the thing about Douglas, he's a Democrat from the North, so he's Northerner, he's not a slave owner, doesn't care about slavery, but he's a Democrat. So he's this big coalition party that kind of straddles the North and the South and whatever. But Douglas doesn't give a crap about any of this. He just wants to pass bills, and like all Illinois senators, what does Stephen Douglas want to be when he grows up one day? Right? Anybody? President of the United States. That's what he wants to be. And he figures, I'll pass this compromise, boom. And like Clay ran for president like 87 times and failed because he cut a deal with John Quincy Adams in 1824, which dogged his career for the rest of his life. The corrupt bargain is what Andrew Jackson called it, which was like branding. And it hung around his neck for like 35 years. And Douglas figured, look, I do the same thing and I don't do the corrupt bargain. And like, boom, White House for me. Right? And it worked. The package that Douglas put together was called the Compromise of 1850. It had a bunch of stuff in it. It had California comes in as a free state. We're just going to have to do that. And the Missouri Compromise, states come in pairs, slave free, keep the numbers even. We're just going to throw that out the window and just say, we'll figure it out. We're going to organize territories in Arizona, New Mexico. The Arizona territory is Arizona, Utah, and the New Mexico territory is Utah, Colorado, I want to say. And they put them on the road to statehood, figuring that'll be a slave state down the road. The Southerners are all excited about using slaves to mine for gold or whatever in the desert, which I'm sure is like, oh, that's not going to be death sentence for the slaves, or what? I guess you don't care about that. And so, yeah, I mean, we know the slave. Ask the slave owners; they love the slaves. It's like, well, that's a lie. Yeah, sure. Yeah, prisoners with jobs. Yeah, sure. I mean, it's mm-hmm. So anyway, and so what are the other provisions of the thing? Well, Texas renounces some of its northern territories in return for getting money from the government, and also the government brokers a deal that sets the Rio Grande instead of the Nueces River as the southern border of Texas. Which, if you don't know anything about Texas, I'm sorry, because Texas is great. I am part Texan, and so I love Texas in a way that I do. I mean, Dr. Pepper, the magical water, does come from Texas, and we must acknowledge that. And anyone who doesn't like Dr. Pepper should just like Dr. Pepper because it's the best. And Chris, I mean, you get these exceptions for you. Chris has 2 children, one of whom doesn't like Dr. Pepper, and it's wrong and upsetting. It's wrong. It's upsetting. Yeah. So I mean, and Chris's kids, they know which one I'm talking about. They know. Kai is good. And so, having said that, if you know anything about Texas, that's a huge slice of southern Texas that lies between the Nueces and Rio Grande, and America's gonna get it. Yay, America! And so, along that though, there's just a couple of things. The anti-slave people have been agitating to get rid of slavery in the District of Columbia, and this is for real important because they figured that the District of Columbia is a place where slavery there was no state government, and so district is run by the federal government. So you could ban like slavery is everything in the District of Columbia could be banned or unbanned by the federal government. Right? It's in the Constitution that the federal government exercises oversight over the District of Columbia, and it's complicated because they have their own city government and stuff. They didn't in those days; it wasn't incorporated as a city. So everybody figured if like slavery in the capital is a blight. Right, the Southerners used to, the Europeans used to come and they used to go to tours where they'd be like, oh, here's the Washington Monument, and here's like the Capitol building, and here's like, like, oh, the whatever, and like here's a slave auction. And on clear days when they threw the windows of the Capitol open, you can hear the slave auctions down the street, right? And so, remember, Dr. Johnson said, my favorite quote ever. He said, "You hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes." Right? Which is, of course, here's the American. I'd be like, oh, 1776, my rights are so repressed. I have the freedom. Yeah, oh yeah. And so, yeah, help all being repressed. Let me just whip this black guy again, right? And the British are like, you don't see it. It's not weird to you. It's like that's not, you don't get, and the Americans are like, what? I don't understand. And so the abolitionists movement point out that this is like pretty, if you're gonna like sell people, maybe you don't do it in the front porch of the Capitol. I mean, maybe we could like take that somewhere else, right? But they also figured that this was a way to get a ban on slavery, and if it worked, it's precedent, right? The next time Southerners say the federal government doesn't have the power to ban slavery, you'd be like, well, I don't know, bitch. How about D.C. ban it there? Right, and the next time you take a the federal government acquires territory, like the Louisiana Purchase or the Mexican Cession or whatever, and you say, well, let's ban slavery in those territories. Well, the Southerners say, oh, the federal government has the power to ban slavery in any territory it controls. It's like, I don't know, bitch, D.C. Have you heard of it? And so that was on the issue. They've been submitting these massive petitions, and there were like parades, and there was like letters, and it was all this thing. Sometime we got to talk about the petition fight with John Quincy Adams. Yes. But like, yeah, but like they were 19th century protests. So the 19th century protests tend to either be a stately parade or like we're just going to burn shit down. And so this was ladies and stuff. So it was abolitionists, church ladies. So it was very like, let's have a parade. Yeah.
Columbia and several other states where it's illegal in other states.
DC voted to legalize marijuana for I don't know if it was medical or personal use. But the Congress.
I don't think they voted to legalize it. They voted to decriminalize.
But Congress rescinded it because Congress has the final say over what goes down in the DC. And I don't know if they addressed that, but it was a couple years ago. Congress was like, no, and it was super annoying because like 75% of people in DC backed whatever level of marijuana legalization they had, and everybody was like, okay, pretty much everybody in DC thinks this is okay, it's fine, and Congress was like, no. And that's what the abolitionists talking about, right? Like in the Constitution, the Congress has the power to regulate DC. So you could say, like, the federal government can't ban slavery in Virginia because it doesn't really have the power to affect that kind of a state. Yeah, you can't really overturn state laws at the federal level unless it's like specifically unconstitutional. And slavery is not unconstitutional. Slavery is totally constitutional in 1850. There's multiple times in the Constitution that slavery is legalized. So, but like DC is not a state. DC is a territory governed by the Congress, right? So, and then again, out west, you have California's not a state. Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, Nevada, those are not states. Those are territories run by the federal government until they become states. And so you could just go ahead and free them right now. I mean, and then it's done. I mean, once it's free, it's hard to make it into a slave territory, right? See, that was the thinking, right? That was the idea the abolitionists had, was get this ban into law, and then it's like it's done, right? Yeah. Okay. So anyway, the fourth one is a whopper. The Southerners have been agitating for a while about fugitive slaves. Now, was this a big problem? Yes or no? No, in the sense that relatively small numbers of slaves actually ran away, in the sense that they fled all the way to the north or were able to get there. The Southerners had a fairly robust system for catching fugitive slaves. They had patrols and stuff, which is almost like the beginning of like the police in America in the South in a way. The metropolitan police in big cities in the North clearly come from like London, and the metropolitan police, which is in like the 1820s in London. But Southern police forces often were more like kind of sheriff's posses and stuff that were these patrols they did to catch slaves. The trick is once you patrol enough, the slaves they're not stupid. They're rational actors. The irony, of course, is slavery denied that slaves were rational actors, and yet often the Southerners would act like the slaves were and provide them incentives, right? And they understanding that the slaves would obey the incentives like all rational people would. And so a lot of slaves fled temporarily. They would often come back because they knew that trying to flee in the long term was unsustainable. And generally, when you fled in the long term, you got caught and you got killed. And if you could talk to a slave on the sly and be honest with him and say, "Would you like to run away?" he would surely say, "Oh, of course, I don't want to be a fucking slave." But on the other hand, he would say, "Look, but I don't want to die either." And so you got to like think about like and you got a family, you got a kid. I mean, and it's not going to stop people from trying. There were people who would try, right? There were people who would succeed, right? But the Southerners had a pretty good lid on some of this in the Deep South, where it is, of course, very hard to get away. Mississippi is not the same as Maryland or Kentucky, right across the border from a slave state, right? And so, right across the border from a free state, right? And so, in Constitution 1789, it says Article 4 something. It says something about all people held to service or labor in one state and escaping into a state thereof, where such labor is not due, are still obliged to discharge their labor to the person of whom it is due. And what that says in English is basically, if you're a slave and you escape to a free state, you are not a free person. You have to go. You can be brought back. Well, there's a law, 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, that they enacted, and the law never amounted to a damn thing. It was impossible to enforce. I always ask people in class, how would you enforce this law? You sue a guy, I guess he stole himself from you, and you go to court, and the judge says Northern Court, because you catch him in Massachusetts or some shit, and the judge asks the guy, what's the deal? And you're like, well, it's my former slave over here. He ran away, whatever. And the judge says, okay, all right, that's your claim. And they ask the other guy, what do you say? And the guy's like, I've never seen this fucking guy in my life. He's just a fucking guy. And the judge is like, I'm like, all right. And he's like, you have any proof that this black guy over here is you? The guy's like, well, I totally own him. Like, I whip him stuff. And the black guy's like, I've never seen this guy. He's full of shit. And the judge is like, I don't know. Bang. Like, I don't know. And so today, if you think about it, today, if you own a slave, you get DNA, you get pictures, you get video. What?
Today, if you owned a slave, let's be glad that there are no enslaved people in the United States today.
No. And like
Conventional
modern day
speaking.
slavery is a thing, right? But you have like in Saudi Arabia, all the guest workers, they take their passports, right? And then they got the way. But like today, if you had a plantation with a bunch of slaves, you would get like pictures and DNA and stuff. And that way, when they ran away and the court was like, do you know this guy? You'd be like, yeah, here's a video of me with the guy. Here's me, like, like physically whipping him. His picture is like, here's his DNA. Here's a picture of me with him. And it would be impossible to deny. But in the 19th century, there was no way to have that evidence, right? And so northern courts, in the very few cases that were brought, tended to just free those people. They tended to say, well, there's not enough evidence to justify returning a guy to slavery. Yes. You have a question?
I was perfect.
Okay, I'm sorry. You're acting all like questioning. Like I don't want to be. If someone in the audience has a question, right? So, having said that, the Southerners want a stronger fugitive slave law. And in the history of the South, this is the biggest self-own that they have. It's a totally stupid decision. I'm trying to get drunk because we're doing the thing. Yeah, drinks. And so it's a complete. What did he say?
He said we're doing s'mores, and you said drink.
I might be doing s'mores. I don't know. I'm doing drinks right now. And so it's fine. We're all fine. Let's bring conversation here. So the Southerners had this sort of like they're like they get all worked up about this. They get all riled up about it, and they're like, we gotta have a better fugitive slave law, guys. And the irony is the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad is actually really small. It's not very big. They don't actually catch very many fugitives. It's a lot of well-intentioned white people who are engaging in this sort of performative activism. There are some really dedicated people who actually put their lives on the line. There's a lot of other people who don't sacrifice very much, but do help, which is due credit. And of course, there's very, very brave people like Harry Tubman, for example, who as a black lady, she went back into the South where she could be re-enslaved, right? And instead rescued people, right? But it was really minor. And the Southerners tended to portray the Underground Railroad as this like huge, huge thing. And it suited everybody because if the Underground Railroad is this big thing, then the Southerners need to be protected against it. And of course, if the Underground Railroad and you're like five guys and Harriet Tubman, right, and a bunch of well-meaning Northerners who were like donating money to the five guys who were then helping Harriet Tubman put together her daring escapes, it helps you to have the Underground Railroad appear in the newspapers to be this like massive organization that every Northerner belongs to, right? So you can understand why the propaganda sort of helps out both sides. So the Southerners argue, if this is true, we need a better fugitive slave law because these Underground Railroad bitches are out here freeing everybody, right? They're freeing tens of thousands of people a year. And it's like, well, I mean, no, they're not, but whatever. Yeah, this is a question.
It's not a question, but I wanted to interject that there are even today a lot of myths that people still believe about the Underground Railroad because they were so good about their propaganda, such as the quilts, the black what are the lawn jockeys and things like that, and the fact that there's a lot of myths out there today that we still believe about quote unquote stops along the Underground Railroad.
Like it's this whole organized thing. No, it's really not. It's a bunch of people who put together like on the. It's not. There's no organization or anything. Like Harriet Tubman, like they put together these like trips for her, and she plans out where she's going to go, and she knows where she's been from there, whatever, and she'll go and do it. But there's not like this giant infrastructure of like they have a network of cells and whatever, and it's nothing like that. But again, the Underground Railroad is not going to say, they're not going to go on TV and be like, or in the newspaper and be like, hey guys, we're actually like 80% smaller than you think, right? Because actually just me and a few other guys, and we have some brave people like you say Harry Tubman over here, whatever goes on. It's like really not very big. And of course the Southerners also are not willing to admit that it's that small either, because then it's not a threat, right? So the Southerners use that as justification for the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, which is a much stricter law that they get passed. Douglas passed it. Douglas doesn't give a crap about slave. I mean, like whatever. The Fugitive Slave Law is not going to affect Illinois. There's like what, like 2 black people there. Like who cares, right? But what he doesn't understand is how this is going to play in the North. The abolitionists are able to portray this as this like apocalyptic thing. Like, look, now slavery is everywhere, because now they portray it as like now the entire United States has been turned into a jail and you're the jailer, right? I mean, you the Northerner are responsible. The law has all these wacky things. There's a section of the law that seems to suggest that if you assist in escaping a slave escaping, you're a criminal, which it makes sense if you accept that escaped slaves are criminals. Then like aiding and abetting a criminal is a crime, right? I mean, that makes sense. But it's written so vaguely that some Northerners point out that it seems to suggest that if you don't assist in the capture of a slave, you are also a criminal, which is wild. I mean, that's like, what the hell is that, right? And so, having said that, the Northerners like point that out, and the Southerners in the Northern press, they're like, "Nah, that's not how it's. The judges are not going to think that. The judges are not. That's just, so it was written very sloppily. It just means that if you remember the Underground Railroad, it's a crime because you're helping a criminal, right? And then the Southerners in the Southern press, as though nobody in the North reads the Southern newspapers, they admit that they totally wrote the law like that. And they're like, yeah, no, we want the Northerners, when the black guy's running down the street and the police officer's like, hey, catch the black guy. And you're like, I'm not tackling some black guy. Like, the hell is your problem? We arrest the white guy. We arrest him and then under the law. And the Southerners are stupid because, again, like the press, there's people read the Southern newspapers, and the Charleston Mercury and whatever, they admit that that's why we wrote it the way we did. And the law has a whole thing where the judges who hear the cases about escaped slaves get paid $5 for setting the slave free and $10 for returning them to slavery, which is obviously some bullshit. I mean, there's no other way to describe that. You can give me a break with this bullshit. Right? And so the thing about the Fugitive Slave Act is it sort of nationalizes the controversy. All over the northern United States, there are parades, there are mass meetings, there are newspaper editorials, there are all sorts of reporting about how we are all kind of complicit in this system now, because apparently if we fail to catch black people, we're criminals or whatever. And the Southerners never recover from that. The idea that becomes current in the North is that there is this vast Southern conspiracy to sort of destroy the country and subdue it to the whim of the slave owners. And of course, it's, on the one hand, the Southerners are not organized. They're a bunch of racist jackasses. But on the other hand, I mean, look at all the first presidents: Washington, Adams, but then Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, and then Jackson. And so the first 12 presidential terms, 10 of them are Southerners who own slaves, right? 8 of them are from Virginia. right? And the only two guys that weren't slave owners of the first like 7 presidents are two guys named Adams from Massachusetts. Right? Yeah. And so I mean, the Southerners are they do seem to exercise a lot of control over the government. And the Fugitive Slave Act seems it's like an unpopular law that Southerners got passed for no reason other than they got just like upset about it, right? So this sort of escalates the tension a lot, right? And so along the way, what you get a couple years later is the rise of the Free Soilers, a political party which explicitly rejects slavery in the West, right? And that's the flashpoint of the Civil War: is slavery going to spread to the Western states? Does the federal government have the power to ban it? Should it be, should this all the states be? I see you, Faye. All the states be free or slave or whatever. And the Free Soilers, they argue that is they call free soil, free labor, and free men. That's what we need to do in the West: free soil, free labor, and free men. Right? And they think slavery is an inefficient labor system that is bad for both black and white people. Right? And that's the big argument: is if you paid people, they work harder. And we know today, Edward Baptist wrote a great book about the fact that actually slavery was a pretty efficient labor system if you don't mind, killing black people. Right? In terms of extracting labor, it's way more efficient than money because people work harder when you threaten to cut their face off, right? Or their kid's face or whatever, right? But the Free Soil Party comes along as a result of the Compromise of 1850. All those things are called the Compromise of 1850. And then you go a couple of years and you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Douglas had wanted to organize the Kansas and Nebraska territories. And he wanted to organize this territory and turn it into states because he wants to build a transcontinental railroad to go to California. California's getting big. There's gold out there. There's people coming. There's crazy immigration. Freights. There's a ton of money to be made shipping freight to California. They need everything. They don't make anything there. And so the trick is the Southerners want the railroad to go from either like Louisiana through Texas, or they want it to go from St. Louis through the center of the country. And the fuck is that? All right. All right, whatever. Douglas wants it to go through Chicago, right? And it makes sense. The Transcontinental Railroad, the entire railroad network of the East Coast, east of the Mississippi, is going to go through, for a while, one railroad to California, right? Now, eventually, there's going to be a bunch. There's going to be like 20, 30, 40 years down the road, there's going to be a bunch. But for a while, every pound of freight that goes east to west, west to east, every passenger goes east to west, west to east, is going to go through that one city. So think about it. That one city is going to have the slaughterhouses for the beef that's going west, the gold that's coming in, the passengers. It's a ton of business for the city, right? Hotels, restaurants, amusements, freight terminals, warehouses, slaughterhouses, switch yards, prostitutes, bars. All that money is going to come to the city that hosts the terminus of the first transcontinental railroad. And so Douglas puts together the Kansas-Nebraska Act to get Kansas, Nebraska into the Union, which will mean that the railroad can go from Chicago west through Nebraska all the way to the California. And he figures once they get started on the railroad, they're not going to want to change. Once they start laying track, you're good. You got it. But the railroads aren't going to go through territory. They're going to go through state. They want to deal with state government. So you got to get that started, right? That's why he does it. And so he proposes a plan that had been put forward by Michigan Senator Lewis Cass, who was a real dipshit. Sorry, Michigan. And Cass ran campaign ads in 1848, where north of the Mason-Dixon line, he was a slavery moderate, and south of the Mason-Dixon line, he was a super hardcore pro-slavery guy, which is like, I don't know if you think I'm stupid or whatever, but like people can read newspapers in different parts of the country, moron. And so it didn't work super great for him. So anyway, he had this idea called popular sovereignty. What?
Sorry, I was drinking. My super skeptical face was based on my current anecdata that people are in fact
Yeah,
really
they're pretty stupid.
Yeah, they're pretty stupid.
But I mean,
Yeah.
drinks.
What stupid that's
Which paradoxically makes us dumber. Like, it's weird though, because you have a phone in your pocket that has all information. So you don't have to. You don't have to ask anybody basic information, right? Yeah, oh yeah, we launched a guy. We also got to move like 100 times less power than that. Yeah, but on the other hand, like now we're all just like we have all this information. We're still stupid. It's cats, it's porn, it's video games, internet shopping. That's all it is. It's boobs, cats, internet, video games, internet shopping. Yeah, I mean, it's all. Yeah, what do they say in Avenue Q? The internet's for porn. Avenue Q is a musical, and it's about like Muppets, but it's like R-rated. And so there's a whole song, "The Internet's for Porn." So yeah, well, I mean, whatever. So Cass had put together this idea called popular sovereignty, where the people in the state vote to whether they want to be a slave or a free state, and it would overturn the Missouri Compromise. But it's popular because it's like, why should we in Congress decide your state's bullshit, right? Like, you vote. It seems very democratic to let the people in the state vote. Also, it's not my fucking problem, right? Like, we don't have to fight about this shit anymore. Let these people fight about it. And of course, if you're a Southerner, what?
Sorry, I'm just laughing because Heather posted in the comment the next line of the internet.
Is it Heather Palmer? Is Heather Purry? Austin, yeah, Heather Purry. What's up? There's several Heathers, I know, and it's to be fair, Heather Purry is a long time watcher, so salute to you. And so yeah, in porn, it's good stuff, right? And so allegedly, I don't know anything about that adult content. So having said that, so it's not popular sovereignty, right? So when we say, well, Douglas proposes this, and the Southerners back it, and some of the Northerners back it, and so Kansas, Nebraska agree to come into the Union, and what's going to happen is they will appoint a territorial governor. The territorial governor will have an election. The election will be like county by county. I guess every county sends a delegate or whatever, and then those guys, that caucus or whatever, will write a constitution that will be slave or free. And so basically, when you have the election, you're voting whether or not you want to have a slave or free state, right? And so, having said that. That blows up the Whig Party. The Whig Party, the old compromise Whig Party of Henry Clay, and up to this point Abraham Lincoln, it splits over this issue of whether to support popular sovereignty. The Southern Whigs, the Cotton Whigs, they back the act. The conscience Whigs, they don't. And so my bad, we've got audience action. Almost coughed, but I excuse me. I did.
Was it worth
So
it?
everything. This day extracts a heavy toll. Dang.
Take a drink.
But it's going to be more wine. All right. So so the Whig Party, it blows up. The conscience Whigs, the Northern Whigs, they can't support slavery. The Cotton Whigs, they can. So, and the conscience Whigs say to the Cotton Whigs, if you guys support slavery so goddamn much, why don't you just be fucking Democrats? And the Cotton Whigs say, okay. And so what's left of the Whig Party goes on with several other groups of people, the Know-Nothings, anti-immigrant party, the Free Soilers, the anti-slavery expansion party, the abolitionists, to form the Republican Party. 1854 is the first new party in American history since the Whigs reform after the War of 1812. Right, and so, and by the way, so the two parties, Republicans and Democrats, right? Although they're different. There's another lecture we'll have later talk about how they changed. The two most important moments in the foundation of the modern day Republican Party was at the Cow Palace in August of 1964 when they nominated Barry Goldwater, and then earlier that year when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. Which is what set the Republican Party in its modern day trajectory. It was very different than the Lincoln Republican Party politically. So what happens? Well, Douglas gets his Transcontinental Railroad, but he blows up the Whig Party. The Republicans come in, and everything is sort of out the window, right? And the Republicans are explicitly anti-slavery. Some of them are just think slavery's bad. Some of them hate the Southerners, think they're assholes. Some of them think free soil. I don't like slavery to expand. It can stay where it is. There's it's like a big tent, right? You don't like slaves, go into the tent, right? So what happens then is you get a whole series of other events that kind of escalate this division in American politics between these two parties, right? So in no particular order, we got to mention. There's like a little wine here is fine. There's we talk about Kansas. We got to talk about Kansas. So 1856 is election, and Franklin Pierce is out as a drunk son of a bitch. Nobody likes him anyway. He's from New Hampshire. He's the only president I think from New Hampshire is Franklin Pierce. He's alcoholic. He's an asshole. And so 1848 is Taylor, and then he died, and Millard Fillmore took over, and then in 52 Pierce took over, and again he's a drunk alcoholic SOB who's from New Hampshire. We don't like him. And then he was succeeded by James Buchanan, 1856. And Buchanan was a grade A asshole. He was the foreign minister to Britain. He's the ambassador to Britain, so the court of St. James. So he didn't have anything to do with his bullshit for like years, which is great because like imagine if you found a Republican that had been frozen in a cryogenic pod for 10 years in 2020, you could thaw this person out and then they don't have like anything to do with any controversy over the past decade. So if they declare for the presidency, the first question that they're not going to get asked is, what do you think about every horrible thing the current Republican Party has done? That guy would be like, I don't know. I've been in a pod for 10 years. I don't fucking know. Right? Like, it's 2010, right? And so Glee is still popular, isn't it? And so, well, I mean, the guy's in a pod. He doesn't know. He doesn't know about anything. Right? He doesn't even know about the last movie he saw featuring the Avengers was The Avengers. So he doesn't even know about any Ant-Man. He doesn't know Spider-Man. He doesn't know Spider-Man. He doesn't know the North Korean hackers are the reason that Spider-Man got to be in Marvel movies, which is a crazy, wild, so almost as wild as the story about how Star Trek and boobs is why Obama got to be president, which is a whole other wild thing. So anyway, having said that, that's the Buchanan's thing. Is like he's been away from the country, so he just pretends not to know anything about anything, and it works. He gets elected, right? And along the way, though, it causes this huge controversy. We should mention, by the way, Buchanan is a bachelor, lifelong bachelor, and it is almost certain that he was totally was homosexual. He carried on an affair for a long time with some guy in Washington D.C., and it was like 99% that he was gay. But of course, he wasn't exactly going to come out and say it in 1857, right? So right at the cusp of the 1857 inauguration, you have two major events that happen, right? So. Get my shit.
Are you sure you need more?
I'm just gonna open it. It's fine. Yeah, and so got the rabbit. And so yeah, and so what happened is that two things. First, what happened is it's fine. We're fine. Oh, there we go. Done. We got it. Oh, we gotta. You said I wouldn't get it. People. Oh, ye of little faith. Should I lift my shirt and let you put your hand into my wound?
No.
You doubting Thomases? Everything's fine. We're all fine. Yeah.
Just remember, you don't want to repeat.
No, we're fine. It's fine. We're all fine. So, so what happens? Okay, so two things happen. Right. The first is Kansas. All right. So Nebraska, nobody gives a shit about Nebraska. No one. We're never talking about it again. No one gives a fuck about it. Right. But I mean, if you're from Nebraska, it's great, I guess. I mean, let's be honest.
We're from Florida.
I mean, Florida, land of awesomeness, alligators, and crazy people. What does Nebraska got? Grass, tornadoes,
Meth.
Huskers. So I'm not interested. Meth. We got meth here. I got meth down the street.
Wait, what street?
Anywhere we want. It's North Florida. You know there's meth around here? You cook meth all the time. Probably there's somebody in Durban is cooking meth right now. You know it. So yeah, Kansas, like Nebraska, better. Right? And so I can't believe you. I mean, it's meth all over. There's certainly somebody within 20 minutes here cooking meth. So it's reality we live in. So again, so what happens in Kansas is they have an election for the state legislature, and it goes apeshit. The Southerners are convinced that the Northerners are sending people to pack the election and fake it all. There's like one charity sending Irish immigrants to Kansas or whatever. It's Harriet Beecher Stowe's dad, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Harriet Beecher Stowe's dad they sent a bunch of poor Irish people, and the Southerners are like, oh my God, they're trying to sneak people in and whatever. By the way, Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother would end up having a sex scandal in Staten Island in the 1880s where he had sex with an underage parishioner in his church. And it was like the trial of the century. It was all in the New York press. It was this crazy thing. Turns out you shouldn't have sex with your underage parishioners, I guess. And so that's for sure. That's not we're not guessing that.
That's a modern day problem.
Yeah. So anyway, they send some dudes out to Kansas, and the Southerners overreact when they have the election in Kansas. Double the number of people that live in the state vote for the legislature. So it's shenanigans. It's bullshit. It's bullshit. So they got to throw out the election, right? So they do it again, and there's what the Southerners are called border ruffians. They ride in and they start just shooting up the place. David Atchison is my favorite. He's a former senator from Missouri. He rides out to Kansas to protect the institutions of our great republic, which he means slavery. And he, with a bunch of his buddies drinking whiskey, they shoot up polling places and kill voters, which is like, well, I mean, fuck that. So anyway, they did vote illegally. The voters, I mean, whatever, they burned the ballots and stuff. I mean, it's this whole thing. So what ends up happening is after this election, the Free Soilers claim that the Southerners cheated, which is accurate, but they claim that that means they won, which is not accurate, right? And so what you end up with is two governments. The Southerners set up a government for Kansas in Lecompton, and the Free Soilers set one up in Lawrence until the mob drives them out and burns the hotel they're using as a government, and they go up to Topeka, right? And so you end up with two, and they submit two constitutions to Congress. So in his inaugural address, Buchanan, who is a real dipshit, says that he thinks the Lecompton government is totally fine. And it's like, that shit is as fake as a $3 bill, you dumb motherfucker. I don't know what the fuck you're saying. But I mean, that's the only way you can talk about Buchanan, because he is a real dipshit. He is #1, the worst American president. There's a guy, the house is on fire, and he's like, I don't even feel hot. I don't even see fire. I think it's fine. This is fine. And it's like, everyone's like, bitch, it's on fire. He's like, it's not on fire. You're full of shit. And it's like, imagine being that dumb, right? So at the same time that this is percolating, right, you end up with a Supreme Court case, is Dred Scott v. Sanford. Sanford was a guy that got hired to be a doctor by the Army. He goes up north of some god-awful place in the Great Plains, takes his slave up there, Dred Scott, live up there for a while. Scott marries a black lady, a free lady, Harriet, and they go back south. And the Army fired Sanford, whoever the doctor was, because he's a drunk son of a bitch. And they fire him. And Dred Scott, there's a whole complicated thing about who owns Dred Scott, right? Because like there's a whole probate thing, and it's like, well, I guess the doctor died and he passed it to his kids, but they fight over the bank and whatever. But somebody points out to Dred Scott, you spent a long time living in a free state, so like maybe you're not a slave. And Dred Scott's like, that's stupid. And he's like, wait a minute, it doesn't actually seem that stupid. Like I really did. Harriet is like, I don't know, like we lived for like 10 years in a free state. And Dred Scott's like, yeah. And so with some help from some lawyers, he sues. And the problem is they got to find out who actually owns Dred Scott. Like, because the federal court is like, okay, well, who are you suing? Like, who is the person on the other side of the case? But eventually they settle on whoever the crap Sanford is, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the question is basically, does Dred Scott, having lived in a free state, is he a free person? It's not a fugitive slave thing, because he didn't flee. Right? He went voluntarily. His owner took him. Now, a lot of the northern states have temporary residency laws. In Vermont, you can take your slaves and live there for 30 days, and it's totally legal. But 31 days, you got to pay a fine, and after a certain point, they become free. So you can go hunt and fish in the woods in Vermont with your slaves for 29 days. Right? It's for real. And so, having said that, you got to get those tourist dollars. Having said that, the drinks. Drinks, yeah. And so, having said that, this is the case in Dred Scott v. Sanford, 1857. The case is heard in 1856, but the Supreme Court issues a verdict in 1857. And what the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is Roger P. Taney. His name is spelled Taney, and I used to think it was Taney, but I actually got drunk with a guy in Italy who assured me that he wrote a book about Taney, and his name was pronounced Taney because it's like a Maryland thing. And I bought his book. It's a pretty good book. So it was when we were in Tuscany that one time. It was the dude was on the, and we were kind of like, that's not for real. And the guy gave us his name, and my mom went on Amazon and ordered his book, and we were like, the picture in the back of the book was like, holy shit, that was, we drank wine with this dude and got shit faced on a villa in Tuscany, and it was a really good book. I don't remember the guy's name. It's up in my library. And so, what?
Sounds like you can still do that for Vermont.
No, this shit's totally legal now because slavery is illegal. You can't own slaves in Vermont. But it was up until 1860. Yeah, up until 1865, it was legal to take, well, maybe 1861, you could take your slaves temporarily to some states. Vermont, I think, in New York was another one. And so, having said that, the case that Tawney got was, is this guy Dred Scott a slave, right? And the thing about the Supreme Court is they could have ruled on this shit like super narrow, right? So like back in the day, a couple years ago, California banned gay marriage, and then the California government, it was a whole popular referendum things, Prop 8, I think. California's got a whole bunch of props, they're all bullshit. 187 is the prop that's the reason nobody in California is Republican anymore, because it was a super racist thing about illegal immigrants or whatever. And that was in the 80s. And Prop 8 was basically the state's going to say marriage is between a man and woman. Well, it passed like narrowly after this huge campaign, and it immediately got challenged in the California court. So the governor, who was at the time is Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, who is my favorite robotic governor, and he's a Cyberdyne Systems Model T101, as they say. I mean, he's a robot, so he has a lot of free time to have a second family. Okay, he doesn't sleep. So what else is he supposed to do from the hours of midnight to 8 a.m. or whatever, right? And so anyway, Schwarzenegger was like, "Look, I'm not defending that in court. Like, I'm not going to spend state resources defending a law that is clearly unconstitutional according to the California Constitution, which has a human rights guarantee." And so a bunch of conservative lawyers ponied up the cash to defend the law from the challenge that some gay dudes brought against it, some guys from San Francisco, and they sued and said this law violates our constitutional rights. It's like, okay. And when the case hit the California court, they threw it out and they appealed to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court could have taken the case and they could have been like, nah, gay marriage is legal or not or whatever. But they didn't do it. Instead, they ruled on the very narrow ground that the conservative dudes didn't have the right to bring a case or to defend a law that the California government wasn't going to defend. Right? They didn't have what's called standing, the right to bring a legal case. Yeah.
I just find it amusing how much we can tie together the fact that you're talking about the lead up to the Civil War and very seamlessly can go into the whole gay rights Prop A issue in California, and it all completely makes sense.
Gay rights and black people's rights is like almost like discrimination is bad, anyway. I don't know. It's weird. Draw your own conclusions. So anyway, and this in 2011, 3 years later, the Supreme Court actually did. I want to say it was 3 years later. It was Obergefell v. Hodges. They did rule that gay marriage was legal. That case was about a lady who was married to a woman. Woman died, and she didn't get her wife's. They were married legally in Vermont or whatever, but she didn't get her wife's federal Social Security benefits. And she sued, and the Supreme Court was like, nah, that's bullshit, and they made gay marriage legal. And that was a case that when it went to them, there was really no other way to hear it. But in the California case, they said, we just don't think that these random conservative lawyers have the right to hear the case. Well, in a way, Tawney could have done the same thing. He could have said, Dred Scott just doesn't have the right to bring a case. He's a slave. Slaves can't sue anybody. It's you can't. And instead, Tawney thought that she's, no. All right. There's going to be a test later, so okay. It's going to be a test. It's for real. You have to take it.
So what's the penalty? Do you have to do a shot?
Yeah. And so Tawney figured instead he had this idea. He's like, Tawney, by the way, is like 97 million years old. He looks like fucking corpse. He was appointed to the bench by Andrew Jackson, so that gives you a clue how long he's been on the fucking court. Tawney figured, I can just settle this shit right now. He's like, I can fucking just do this because the Supreme Court, everybody likes us, we're awesome, okay, and we can just handle this. So he issues this ruling in Dred Scott, and in Buchanan's inauguration, he previews it. Tawney had approached Buchanan and been like, bitch, here's my ruling, like read this shit, it's tight, you're gonna fucking love it. And Buchanan, in his inauguration, gave a speech where he was like, I think the Supreme Court's going to handle this bullshit because I'm a fucking dumbass. And I read the ruling, and I think it's great. I'm a fucking dumbass. Right? It's like that person who comes to you and is like, man, I just read Twilight, and it's better than War and Peace. And it's like, well, it's not. I know, Heather, I know you like Twilight, but it's not as good as War and Peace. And so I should have picked something different. I should have picked another worse book. I don't want to piss off my longtime listeners. Obergefell, yeah, Obergefell and Hodges. That's the gay lady whose wife died and she didn't get the Supreme Court or the Social Security. That's the action. Oh, okay. Well, whatever. Damn. They folded a bunch of cases together. I'm pretty sure Obergefell was a lady. Now I gotta look it up. Now I gotta go upstairs. The book about it, by the way, is a book. I forget the author's name. It's called The Gay Rights Revolution. It's a pretty good book. It came out a couple years ago. So anyway, you thank Justice Kennedy, who wrote the majority opinion in all three cases involving gay rights. It was there was the one about the obscenity laws, in which Scalia wrote the medieval opinion about gay people being stupid, and there was another one, and then there was Obergefell v. Hodges. So it was, what the fuck was the one about the obscenity laws and the criminalization of homosexuality? It wasn't Planned Parenthood v. Casey. It was Dover v. Kitzmiller. No, that was the intelligence design. I don't remember. I'm drunk. So anyway, Tawny had this bullshit idea where he would just wrap this shit up with a bow and it would be done, right? It would be just done. We don't have to talk about it anymore. And so he issued this mega ruling, right? So he said first, Dred Scott is a black guy, he's a slave. He's not a citizen. He doesn't have the right to sue in federal court. Well, you could stop there. You could say, look, Dred Scott can't sue in federal court, so we're done. That's it, right? You know, it's like a student comes to you and is crying about something. You say, look, you're not my student. Get the fuck out. I don't care.
Hawk says you were thinking of the U.S. versus Windsor, which was the DOMA ruling.
There's a DOMA one, yeah. What was the one where it was the law in Texas that criminalized homosexuality, and they threw it out, and Scalia said that he wanted those laws to exist because he wanted society to remember that homosexuality is bad because he was a fucking asshole. That's the one I can't remember the name of. It was, and when he said he's going to know it, and when he types it, it's going to piss me off. Because Planned Parenthood v. Casey was about substantial burdens on abortion access, and I can't remember the other one. But anyway, Tawney issues that ruling, but he goes even further. He said, so anyway, if Dred Scott could sue in federal court, he's not a free person. Taking a slave to a free state doesn't make them a free person. But then he's like, also
Interjection.
Yeah.
Lawrence v. Texas.
Lawrence v. Texas. Fuck. Lawrence v. Texas is, and Scalia, remember, Scalia's an asshole. Scalia's a prick. Scalia went out of his way to be a dick in that opinion because he didn't have to be, but he was like, I think laws criminalizing homosexuality are great because I'm a jackass, which is a for real quote. Yeah.
Bless his heart.
Bless his heart. Yeah. Well, he's dead anyway. So in his
Okay, I'm sorry.
Other Southernism. Rest his soul.
rest his soul. Mm-hmm. Bless his heart. So drinks. What? It's Fing. Fing. All right. Come here, Fang. We're gonna pick ups. No, we're gonna go pick ups, Fang. Okay. All right. This is our mascot dog. This is Fang. Mwah. Okay. Go ahead, Fang. Run and be free. Yeah, it's okay. Go do whatever you want. You want to go out? Of course, you want to go out. No, you can't do that right now. So anyway, what can we say about the third one? The third one is Tawny says Dred Scott can't sue, but if he could sue, he's not free. And also, the Missouri Compromise and any restriction on slavery anywhere in America by the Congress is unconstitutional. And so it's like, you know, I mean, like, holy shit, right? And so Tawny previews this to Buchanan because Tawny thinks he's going to wrap this shit up with a bow. We're done. I'm a fucking genius. You know, I'm great. And by the way, Tawny's often been portrayed as this super nasty, bitter old slave owning asshole, which is not totally correct. He's an asshole, and he is bitter and old. But he's in from Maryland, which is the Diet Coke of slave states. There's like 2 people that are slaved in Maryland. Nobody's a slave in Maryland. It's on the border of the North. It's like there's very, 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 very limited numbers of slaves. The dominant activity with slaves in Maryland from 1800 to 1860 was selling those people to South Carolina to make money because there was not valuable in Maryland anymore. And when Tawny became an adult, his dad died and he inherited all his dad's property, which was a bunch of slaves, and he freed them all. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm interjecting because you said it's like nobody, according to the 1860 census, the number of people enslaved were 87,000.
In Maryland?
It says in Maryland.
87,000 is way too many. That can't be right.
I'm just saying,
Right.
don't say there's nobody enslaved when you.
Well, compared to South Carolina, where there was probably like 9 million.
I'm sorry, it's still more than 2.
Yeah, well, okay. I mean, I'm a little somewhat. So anyway, what Tawny did is he got all these slaves and he freed them. And you could say, oh, okay, well, he just kicked their asses out and said, fuck out. But actually what he did is he got them all jobs. And then he gave them all leather wallets with $100 cash. And he said, look, I want you, this is a job I got for you. Here's this money. And you go do the job for a while. You save up some money. You go do something else. But like, you got a good start. And so Tawney is not this like heartless and cruel guy, right? He apparently is just a moron who thinks that him being on the Supreme Court means that when he opines on this issue, he can do so in a way that will settle this whole controversy. Like for 100 years, we've been fighting about this shit. But no. Tell us more, Tawney. It's fine. And so, as you can imagine, the Dred Scott decision, Buchanan previews it because he's a dipshit, and it's also unconstitutional for him to do that. And when the smoke clears, the Supreme Court issues it in 1857, and everybody just goes apeshit, right? The Southerners are like, oh, the Supreme Court says everything we've ever said is accurate. Like, what a great decision. And the Northerners are like, wait, like, that's bullshit. And they read Tawney's opinion, and it's bullshit. It's horse hockey. It's as bad as 2007 DC v. Heller, when Scalia just invented some shit to justify his opinion and was like, look at me make shit up. And it's like, okay, well, but we can read, like, it's, just read it. And Tawney like just invented some stuff and was fast and loose with the Constitution. But Southerners liked it because he gave them what they wanted. And for some reason, Tawney thought that the Northerners would take this, even though the opinion is obviously A, bullshit, and B, totally pro-Southern. So at the same time, what's going on in Kansas? Kansas is a shit show. If you can't win at the ballot box, what do you do now? How are we going to convince people in Kansas we've got to be free? Easy. We're going to find those fucking people and shoot them. That's what we're going to do. We're going to find them all. We're going to kill every single one of those goddamn slave-owning sons of bitches. And so violence explodes all over Kansas. They call it Bleeding Kansas. There's all kinds of violence. In it comes a dude, John Brown, a total loser from up north, who's been married twice, has 87 kids, is a complete dipshit. And after the passage, I think, of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he's in like Ohio somewhere in the back of a church, and the minister's giving a sermon about the act and how bad it is, and he stands up and interrupts the minister and says, here now, in the presence of God and these witnesses, I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery. And then he walks out, and everybody's like, the fuck is that guy's problem? But Brown goes out to Kansas, and he starts massacring slave-owning people or people that supported the Lecompton Constitution. At Pottawatomie Creek, they butcher a whole town full of slave supporters. They didn't own slaves; they're too poor, but they voted for Lecompton. At Osawatomie, he and a bunch of other dudes massacre a bunch of militiamen who surrendered. And so Brown doesn't quite get the traction that he thinks he deserves. So he goes east, and he goes to Virginia to plan some other shit. Right? And so Buchanan wades into this. Right, this is a guy who has this golden opportunity to be above all this shit because he's been out of the country for like 15 years. And instead, he walks in and says, I love Dred Scott. I'm going to get it tattooed on my ass. And then he says, also, the Lecompton Constitution is so great if it was a person, I'd have sex with it. And that's both of those positions are unbelievably unpopular in the North, right? So almost immediately, Buchanan is viewed as a sectional politician. Right, the Northerners call him a doughface. A doughface because he's like a man made of dough, and the Southerners manipulate his face into the expression that they want it to be. We would today call him like a sock puppet or something, right? Yes.
I just need to know, can you feel your nose?
Right there, boom. Yeah, we're not Russia drunk yet. It's coming. It's all right. And so, having said that, what do we say? Well, sectional, yeah. So Buchanan is we're done with that guy. What a dipshit. Right. So what happens? Well, a couple of things happen. 1858, the election, and the Republicans, they ran in 1856. John C. Fremont from California is their presidential candidate. He got his ass kicked. He's wacko. So enough with that fucking guy. And then in 1858, they got a chance to really capture some Senate seats. They got some unpopular things: Buchanan, Lecompton Constitution, Dred Scott, and they do really well in the midterm elections, actually. And in particular, of course, this is where Abraham Lincoln from Illinois runs a good campaign against a Democratic senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas. Lincoln had come from Kentucky, lived in Indiana, moved to Illinois as a young man. He had worked as a land surveyor in Albemarle County, Southern Illinois. He had been involved in Illinois politics. He was part of a group of guys called the Long Nine. There was 9 of them, and they were tall, and they moved the county from to Springfield, Illinois, which worked out great. He had courted the same woman as Stephen Douglas. Her name was Mary Todd, And in fact, Douglas had not married her, but Lincoln had. Somebody once said of Mary Todd, the only reason Lincoln married her is because her dad, Robert Todd, was wealthy, which is, it was true that Robert Todd was wealthy, and it was true that Mary Todd Lincoln was a bit of a handful in terms of being kind of a super bitch sometimes. But Lincoln said of her, it was a very sweet thing. He said, "I have fallen in love with her the moment I laid eyes upon her, and I've never fallen out of love with her since." And so Lincoln got involved in politics, served one term as a Whig member of Congress in 1844, I want to say. He had questioned whether James K. Polk, the president of the time, had legally started the war with Mexico. He demanded that James K. Polk on the map show the spot where the alleged Mexicans had crossed the alleged frontier and killed the alleged Americans, which is a pretty serious. The president lied about why we went to war, and it's some bullshit. And everybody called him Spotty Lincoln because he kept talking about the goddamn spot on the map. Nobody gives a shit, right? And so Lincoln retired from Congress, went off, became a lawyer in Illinois. Only president to hold a patent. He had a patent registered in the 1840s for a device that would lift steamboats up in canals along the Erie Canal. Yes.
I want you to tell the story about the time Lincoln had to jump out the window
Lincoln had to jump out the window.
because he was the only Republic or whatever party he was in the Congress that day, and in order to stop a vote, he had to jump out the window.
Oh, he was a Whig? Yeah, he ended a quorum call by leaping out the window and hiding in the bushes. Yeah, it was good times. And so, I mean, Lincoln was also a noted wrestler. Was a really good wrestler. He was elected an officer in the regiment of militiamen he served in during the Black Hawk War in 1837, fighting the Indians. And he said, "Don't think I'm a soldier. I just was elected sergeant because I bought everybody some beer." And so during the Civil War, he was like, "I'm not like a soldier or anything." Like they're like, "Oh, but you were like a captain," and he was like, "I just bought a keg." So it's like, right. And so Lincoln runs a pretty good race against Douglas in 1858. And the principal thing is Lincoln has been kind of dogging Douglas's career for a while now. When Douglas passed Kansas, Nebraska, remember the senators in those days elected by the legislators, the state legislatures, right? Direct election senators didn't come along until the 1900s, like 1880s or whatever. And so the legislator in Illinois sent Douglas a letter, and they said, basically, get your fucking ass back here and tell us how the fuck you passed this bullshit law. And Douglas said, he came back and he gave a speech where he said, "I could have traveled home along the railroad without a map merely by the light of my burning effigies," right? All the people were burning little Stephen Douglas straw men because they hated him so much. And Lincoln interrupted his speech to say, "I'll refute everything this guy says because he's wrong." And so Lincoln and Douglas had this sort of tetchy career. So they had the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which is, if you were a political junkie like me, for 7 times in the 1858 campaign, they met. They campaigned all over the state, but they met 7 times. And Lincoln let Douglas go first. And in the first debate, Douglas would do 3 hours. Lincoln would do an hour and a half. Douglas would do a 30-minute rebuttal. And then they would switch, and Lincoln would go first the next time, whatever. So that's what 5 hours of political speeches. That was, I'm here for it. But obviously today, like most people, don't care so much about. And Lincoln, everybody agreed Lincoln did really well, right? But Douglas beat him. But everybody thought Lincoln is in pole position to be maybe a Republican candidate in 1860, right? So fast forward to 1859, the situation is still really uncertain. Oh, we didn't even mention Sumner. Sumner, we got to talk about Sumner. Holy shit, I've been having too much fun. Charles Sumner was a Massachusetts Republican. It's like 1857, and Sumner from Massachusetts, a Whig, becomes a Republican. Sumner was the most articulate and forceful advocate in the U.S. Senate of Negro equality, as they called it in those days. His counterpart in the House was Thaddeus Stevens, who was a very nice man who could not accept the fact that he was bald and wore a bad toupee for his whole life. And it carried on an affair with his African-American housekeeper for many years as well. And so Sumner had been to Paris and had gone to the Sorbonne, the medieval university, where he had witnessed black students being educated by French professors of philosophy, and had realized that, in fact, notions of black inferiority were wrong. And so Sumner had gone home, got elected to Congress, got elected to the Senate, and determined to defend black equality. And people asked, they said, when you say that slavery is wrong, you don't mean to suggest that we should treat black people as equals, do you? And Sumner said, yes, right? Like, that's what that means. Like, the black man should not be a slave, but he should also be treated the same as me, right? And everybody was like, wow, holy shit. right? So in 1857, Sumner gives a speech talking about Kansas. He talks about what he calls the crime against Kansas, how Southerners have wrapped themselves in the mantle of democracy and proceeded to conduct an abominable fraud in the elections in Kansas. He singles out Senator Andrew Butler from South Carolina. He says, Andrew Butler has enslaved himself to a mistress who is hideous in all eyes but his own. And he has, for her sake, contravened every principle of democracy and traduced every moral he has had. Right? And basically, what is that, a wacky bird? Sounds like a capuchin monkey. So anyway, herpes. It's a herpes monkey. Get in quick, Dare. It's the herpes monkey.
I'm not worried.
You're not worried? What if they come at you?
I got antibiotics.
Antibiotics. All right, I'm gonna come.
I'm vaccinated.
So anyway, it is considered uncouth to address a senator so directly in the Senate. Even today, when you refer to a senator, you are traditionally held to suggest that you were talking about my great colleague from the great state of Connecticut or something. And so a while, yeah, well, no, you say my esteemed colleague, which is a unisex term. My esteemed colleague from the great state of New York or whatever. And so you don't refer directly, like you don't say like Senator Schumer or whatever. And so a while back, actually on the floor of the Senate, noted exciting Senator Raphael Ted Cruz actually is talked about Mitch McConnell, and he called Mitch McConnell a liar. And everybody, you could hear if you Gesundheit two, give me third. Is the third okay? And you could hear everybody in the Senate be, oh shit, because Mitch McConnell had been called a liar by Ted Cruz. And my favorite quote in the history of all politics is a couple weeks. I don't like Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz and I agree about one thing, and that is the sanctity of Dr. Pepper, because he has the Dr. Pepper fridge in his office because he's from Texas. But like the rest of the time, no, Ted Cruz is a real piece of shit. He's a really awful person. And my favorite quote in the history of politics, South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham went on Face the Nation, and he said, if Ted Cruz shot somebody and you had the trial in the Senate and the senators were the jurors, nobody would vote to convict. And that was like, holy shit. Like, here you are, George Stephanopoulos on CNN, Face the Nation. Yes, Lindsey Graham said if Ted Cruz shot someone in the Senate and you had the trial in the Senate and the senators were the jury, nobody would vote to convict. Nobody would vote to acquit him. We go, whatever. And so I mean, that was like, wow, or did you really say that? But anyway, that's how much of a breach of decorum Sumner had done. So a couple days later, Preston Brooks, Butler's nephew, South Carolina member of the House, comes into the Senate. The senators in those days had desks on the floor of the Senate, and they rearranged them like school. They were like school children's desks with the lift up top and the pocket for your papers. And the cool thing is each desk went with a seat in the Senate, and when you got the seat, they carved your name on it. So you could sit, if you were a Kentucky senator and you lifted the lid, you would see H. Clay, right? If you were a senator from Connecticut, you could lift the lid and you could see who is it, D. Webster, or you could see E. Jerry, right? Or as a Charles Pinckney. No, Pinckney was from Virginia or South Carolina, some shit. And they rearranged them. They bolted them to the floor, but they rearranged them whenever there was a new election. They would shift one party's seats to the side and one party's seat. So Sumner's sitting there writing papers or whatever. Most senators didn't have offices because they hadn't built the office buildings today. And Preston Brooks comes in, and he waits until the tour of ladies leaves, and then he goes over to Sumner and he says some shit like, "You insulted my uncle or what, my state or whatever," and he beats the fuck out of Sumner with his cane, right? And he fractures Sumner's skull, puts him in the hospital. And everybody was like, holy shit, this is how Southerners play. And the Southerners send Preston Brooks more canes and say, break this over the head of another Yankee, right? And so it's 10 minutes, yeah. And so it's crazy. It's crazy the degree to which that is considered acceptable. I mean, it's like the fact that a Southerner beat up a Northerner. The Northerners are horrified. They say, look, Sumner's kind of a prick, and he kind of really goes out there with these speeches, but like, damn, you don't beat the guy up. You use your words and stuff. And the Southerners are like, no, finally somebody's standing up for us. Finally somebody is not, we're not going to be, this abuse that we get is not going to be taken, right? So having said that, it's 1859. The election for president is nigh. And what happens? John Brown happens. John Brown has been hiding in Virginia. He has been planning to attack a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, and he's been planning to use the weapons liberated from the arsenal to free all the slaves. And it'll be a snowball rolling down the hill. You free some, you arm some, you free more, you arm them, and they just light the whole South on fire. And he figures, let's just make this happen, right? A group of millionaires from the North, the Secret Six, are bankrolling him. He has asked anti-slave activist Frederick Douglass if you'd like to come. Douglass is, among other things, not a dumbass, so says maybe like later or whatever. And so instead, John Brown goes down to Virginia with his sons. He's got a former slave from the area, Dangerfield Newby. And Newby is going to help free his wife, who was enslaved on a plantation near the Harper's Ferry, Virginia area. So it's December 1859, it's December 1859. And they attack. They sneak into the town. The mail train is leaving for Richmond, Virginia. And for some reason, they shoot at it. And the train conductor leaps on the train and ducks. They shoot a man on the tracks, a former slave they killed. So that was obviously wasn't great. And in a couple hours, the train pulls into Richmond, and the conductor gets off and says, "Holy shit, you guys! They were shooting me, and they're like these crazy guys." And they're like, "Look, Bob, you're a drunk son of a bitch." And Bob is like, "Look at the goddamn bullet holes in the fucking train." And they look and they're like, "Oh shit, Bob isn't. He's right." So they call the army, right? So what happens? Well, in Harper's Ferry, Brown and his sons, they seize control of the arsenal. They start trying to hand out weapons. The locals get their bird pellet guns and their shotguns, and they go and they surround the arsenal and they start siege, right? And so they kill Newby. By the way, he got shot and was laid in the street, and they mangled his corpse, and the pigs ate him, which is a real son of a bitch of a thing. And so the next morning, in comes the army, none other than Captain Robert E. Lee from the United States military, and I want to say it was Jeb Stuart, who's a real asshole and a son of a bitch, and is going to cost the Southerners the war at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 because he can't stop himself from swinging his dick all the way out to Washington, D.C. We'll talk about it. And so the two of them show up, and I want to say it was Stuart recognized Brown. He goes up and knocks on the gate, and they open the negotiate. And he's like, "You're Osawatomie Creek Brown," and Brown is like, "I am." Stuart's like, "Well, I mean, surrender. We got a place around it." And Brown says, "The hell I will." So they set the building on fire, and it's full of gunpowder because it's a federal arsenal. So Brown and his men come out and they shoot, and they kill a bunch of his sons, and they capture him. He's hurt, but they capture him. They put him on trial. And Brown, they hang him. The Commonwealth of Virginia hangs him. And before they hang him, they ask him if he wants to speak. And Brown says, he says, "I am quite certain that the crimes of this guilty nation shall not be expunged save by fire and blood." And I mean, in a way, that's it. We've gone, the 1850s is a series of events that we've talked about that is just escalating. It's throwing gasoline on the fire until the fire consumes the building, until the fire is so big it cannot be put out. Brown is the end because for the Southerners, this is a terrorist. This is who's been a guy who came into the South to free the slaves. The ultimate thing. The slaves could not free themselves, not because they didn't want to be freed, not because they didn't desire the freedom, not because they didn't have the willpower to do it, but because they lacked the resources to do so. And here is Brown, who is saying, "I will give you a gun, and you can shoot your own way to freedom, and then you can help your friends." And that's the ultimate nightmare. It's the slaves would have maybe they could have freed themselves. There never was a successful slave revolt in the long term. As the French coast in the 1820s out in Louisiana, there was Charleston. There was the big one in Charleston, but they caught those guys. There was Nat Turner, right, in the 1837 in Virginia, but none of those guys managed to get enough pizzazz, enough momentum to really do anything other than temporarily disrupt the system. The one thing that really could have changed the day is if you had a northerner, a white guy who has the freedom of movement, who can go anywhere in the South, who can get on a wagon and just pose as a traveling merchant and go anywhere. He could hand out guns, he could hand out information, he could provide logistical support. Brown is proposing to do exactly that. He was viewed no different in Virginia than we would view Osama bin Laden today, right? And yet in the North, they were comparing him to Jesus Christ. Emerson compared him to an angel of the Lord. Walt Whitman compared him to Jesus Christ himself. The church bells, when Virginia hung Brown, they hung during church bells in the North. and said, and he was viewed as a guy who sacrificed himself for the slaves in a completely Christ-like way, a guy who laid his body on the altar of freedom, to quote Abraham Lincoln from 1863. And so, and that was it. That was how could you go, how could a guy do what he did and be viewed so different by the North and South and not be seen as the end, right? And the Southerners are convinced it would happen again. Somebody somewhere was taking notes and they were thinking, well, if I just did the things Brown did, but I didn't fuck up so much, I could do this, right? We could smuggle guns into Mississippi. We could smuggle, South Carolina is 60% black, 60% black. 40% of the populace is white. You go to one of these goddamn plantations out in the woods somewhere where James Henry Hammond is busy fucking his 16-year-old daughter, and you could shoot that guy because he's alone, and you hand out guns to all the black men on the plantation, and you say, all right, go nuts, and they would. And how would you stop them? How would you possibly stop them? When the population of the county you're in, some of these counties out in Mississippi and the Delta are 90% black. How would you stop that? And as you can imagine, every Southerner is not saying that, but they are thinking it. Right? And in the North, they're crying over this guy like he's Jesus Christ. Right? So in the wake of this comes 1860 presidential election. And it is a real whopper. The Democrats nominate Douglas, who had wanted the presidency for so long, had pursued it so arduously, had sacrificed so much. But the Southern Democrats, they put conditions on it. They say, we want guarantees that you will respect slavery. And Douglas says to these guys, look, I don't give a fuck about slavery. I just want to be president. So I will accept whatever privately, but publicly, no president could expect to win if he had to saddle himself with these conditions. And the Southerners don't accept it. They walk out. When Douglas won't accept their conditions, they walk out and they nominate their own candidate, Charleston. They nominate whoever the hell, I don't remember who the hell it is. Some Southern asshole. The Whigs, what's left of them, they nominate a compromise candidate, Bell from the Constitutional Union Party. And then the Republicans, they get together and they nominate, it's a fight. It's a fight. Lincoln has come east, and at Cooper Union in 1860, he gives a speech. And he gives this whopper of a speech that introduces himself to the Eastern Republican Party politic. And they think of this is his coming out speech, and it is a doozy. Right? He lays out the Republican case against Dred Scott. He lays out the Republican case against Kansas. He lays out the Republican case for free soil, and everybody is pretty impressed. So you go into the convention, Lincoln is the dark horse candidate, but he's got a solid base of support. There's a lot of favorite son candidates. Salmon P. Chase as Ohio. Former governor of New York, William Seward is a candidate. He's a favorite. And Lincoln tells his men, promise nobody nothing. And his men throw that shit out the window because you don't go to the convention in those days. You wait in a hotel nearby in the hopes that maybe you will be summoned to the convention to be asked to be given the nomination. And you wouldn't go to the convention. You would allow the convention to nominate you, and then you would accept it a few days later in a newspaper editorial. The first convention attended by the nominee is 1932, Franklin Roosevelt, the Democrats in Chicago.
John
It's that son of a bitch Breckinridge, the nominee. An utterly forgettable asshole. And so what Lincoln's buddies do is they go to every Republican state delegation and they say, look, we have talked to everybody except you. And we talked to everybody except you. And all that we need from you is if you agree to accept Lincoln as not your first choice, but your second choice, then that would be acceptable. Right? And so there we go. And so if Lincoln doesn't win on the first ballot, you will go to him on the second. And they lie every time but one, because they say, we've already talked to everybody, but you're the only state, Connecticut, Vermont, New York, whatever. And so on the first ballot, it's a deadlock. On the second ballot, there's a break to Lincoln. On the third, fourth, fifth ballot, Lincoln scores the votes. And he leaves behind a bitter set of rivals. Seward thinks that Lincoln is a moron. He's like, this guy's an illiterate hick from fucking the sticks in Southern Illinois, where there's two people and a nothing. I'm the governor of New York State, the most important state in the Union. But Lincoln impresses everybody, right? By the way, they put up an axe in a fence post because Lincoln. This is a fence post that Lincoln split himself because he cut it. And it's bullshit. They went to a woodlot 50 feet away and they got it. Right? I want to say it was like there's old Darwin. Lincoln was born in a log cabin he built with his own two hands. Right? Right. Yeah. I mean, he built it and he was born in it. Right. And so it's bullshit. But Lincoln is a frontier candidate, authentic, a man's man, a people's people, right? And so Lincoln wins. And he chooses Salmon P. Chase. He says, become my Treasury Secretary if I win. So William Seward, he said, become my Secretary of State if I win, right? And he keeps, it's the Godfather principle. Keep your enemies close, but keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer, right? And he does it. And so this leads us to the election of 1860. To make a long story short, Lincoln wins, right? Douglas is hamstrung. Right? Breckinridge takes all the votes in the South and gets none in the North. Douglas gets all the Democratic votes in the North, not enough to overcome his deficiencies with the voting public in the North. Bell carries a couple of middle states, right? Not enough to matter. Lincoln proves that you can become president by winning a plurality of the electoral and the popular vote only from the northern states, only from the northern states. And so Lincoln becomes president. And in response, South Carolina secedes from the Union. South Carolina says the experiment of two peoples living together in two different systems of government has come to an end, and South Carolina secedes in response to the election of the first even limitedly anti-slavery president in American history. Lincoln said, I cannot ban slavery in South Carolina, but I can ban it in federal territories controlled by the federal government. And that's enough. South Carolina says we will not tolerate that. So my executive producer, the lovely and talented Darius, telling me
Just to interrupt you for a moment, I want you to very clearly state.
oh yeah, well, I
the
mean,
cause
why
of
did
the
South
war.
Carolina secede? And thus, so the cause of the war is the secession of the southern states, right? The war is about whether or not they get to be independent. So the question you ask is, why did they secede? Why did they secede? Well, they say South Carolina says it. They said the experiment of two different people living together under the same government with two different sets of institutions has come to an end. What institution are they talking about? What's different about South Carolina and Delaware, or not Delaware, but Massachusetts? Slavery. That's what it is. If you read the declarations of secession that the southern states issue, they mention slavery all over the place. South Carolina mentions it in the first sentence. Texas mentions it, mentions a bunch of other shit, and then circles around to slavery because they say, we were pissed about the other stuff. We wanted to make sure that you knew that slavery was like the biggest issue. Like, we were the most pissed about that. And so the Southerners, they don't lie. The candidate for president they nominate, Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis, the former Secretary of War under the Franklin Pierce administration, a son of a bitch Pierce and a son of a bitch Jefferson Davis. He nominates as his vice president Georgia Senator Alexander Stephens. And Stephens gives a speech where he says, our civilization is founded on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. That's the cornerstone speech. He said, is the cornerstone upon which our Southern civilization rests. And so these guys don't lie. They have no reason to lie. They admit that it's slavery. That's why they think the North is going to ban slavery. They think Lincoln's going to ban slavery. And they think Lincoln says, I can't ban slavery in South Carolina. I can only ban it in the West because I'm not the king of South Carolina, but I am the president of the federal government, which governs the federal territories. The Southerners argue that that is a distinction without a difference, right? They say that Lincoln is saying he cannot do A, he can do B, but A and B are the same thing. It's the question for them is, if you ban slavery out west and you turn all those southern territories into states, they're going to be free states, and then 30 years down the road, the southern states are going to be outnumbered, and they're just going to ban slavery in Congress. There's shit we can do about it. And so the question is not, can Lincoln ban slavery today? He can't, but can he ban it in 30 years? Yes, and he will. He has said he will ban slavery in the federal territories, right? And Lincoln thinks that's not but that's for the Southerners. That's enough. That's enough to get them in a position where they feel that their institution of slavery is threatened. And every other time slavery has come up, they've gone to the mattress to defend it. There's no reason why they wouldn't be willing to do it this time. In the context of the 1850s, violence has become normalized, right? So I guess when we drink next week, we will talk about the Civil War. We'll talk about some of my favorite people. We'll talk about the devout, the almost unafraid Thomas Jackson. We will talk about the drunkard Grant and his crazy friend Sherman. We will talk about Hancock the superb, right? We will talk about one of the great mid-level leaders in the Civil War, one of the great unsung geniuses. We will talk about the vicious Nathan Bedford Forrest, the original genius of the Civil War, a man unschooled in military tactics, and yet one of the best cavalry commanders this nation has produced, a vicious, violent man. We will mention him, and we will mention, we'll mention Grant, the winner of the war, right? And the rough man, as Ken Burns called him, the rough man from Illinois who rose to lead the Union in its hour of greatest trial, right? And so if you join us next week, we'll talk about the Civil War for an hour and a half, right? And then probably next week, Reconstruction. Right, as always, Thanks for coming and stopping by. Questions, comments, concerns, suggestions, topics, put them in the comments. We will try to respond. I know, like I said, I want to say with Sean, maybe. You mentioned Battle of Stalingrad. It's coming. It's coming. We're going to talk about the Witch's Cauldron. We're going to talk about Hermann Goering. We're going to talk about Chuikov. We're going to talk about the Battle of Stalingrad one day because it's a good one. It's a good story. Right? Paul gets promoted to field marshal because Hitler said no field marshal ever surrendered, and then he surrenders a week later. Right? So we'll talk about it. And again, like and subscribe. Thank you for coming by. Questions, let us know. Right?
All right, so join us next week and most Fridays most Saturday nights as Matt gets incredibly drunk and issues a lot of superlatives and calls a lot of people sons of bitches.
I mean,
So
what am I supposed to say about a guy like Breckenridge? That guy.
Jesus
you
Christ.
couldn't even remember his name.
Well, he was. Just...
I don't even remember his name. And then Buchanan. I mean, like Buchanan's dumping gas in the fire, being like, "This will put it out." I'm a dumbass. Like, give me a break with this bullshit, right? I mean, it's like Warren G. Harding over here can't keep his pants zipped.
All right, so join us next week when we talk about Civil War. Until then, have a good week. Bye.